feminism, as we understand it, is not evidence of progress as such. I mean, this was part one of how I came to rationalise still wanting to be a feminist despite not believing in progress. And we think, well, in fact, what we think of as the women's movement it's not evidence of progress. It's women's aggregate response to industrialization, because the Industrial Revolution changed family life. It didn't just make things more abundant and easier to buy. It radically changed how families organised themselves. And whereas previously men and women had worked together within the primary economic unit for most people had been a household. And politics was ordered in that way, in that the political unit was understood to be the household.
That's where economics comes from.
Right, exactly, from the oikos, exactly. The idea of the household economy. And men and women worked together, and their tasks might have been different, but they were all understood as contributing to a productive household, which might include processing raw materials into goods for the family. It might artisan work, the care of children. There wasn't really any meaningful sense that these things were disaggregated, and most of them didn't involve a wage. And what changed with industrialization was that a huge amount of the material work left the home. And in the book, I've taken the example of textile making as having been something which for 20,000 years prior to industrialization was women's work. And there are good reasons for this. I found historians have theorized that textile making has historically been women's work because you can raise a loom off the ground if you're weaving by hand, so your baby won't come along and eat it. It's relatively easy to interrupt if you have to go do something else. It's social, so if you're tied to a relatively small environment, you can do it in company, and so you're not lonely and miserable. It's easy to combine with other tasks, with having little children underfoot. But what happened, if you think about what happens with industrialization, the spinning jenny comes along and sorted other enormous, dangerous, expensive machines, which operate in centralized locations, which might be a long way from your house. So if you want to carry on being involved in textile making, all of a sudden you have choices. You have to make difficult decisions, which you didn't have to make before. What do you do with the baby? Say you have a breastfed baby. Can you take your toddler with you to a factory? I wouldn't. I don't recommend it. Right. And so depending on their social class, under those circumstances, women went in different directions. So I mean, there's a whole working class feminist body of activism which was centered around trying to address the difficulties faced by working class women who had to go and work in the factories and were leaving their children in the most appalling, drugging their babies so they could go and work because their choice, it was either that or starve. This is not or who were physically injured or physically disadvantaged by how arduous the work was relative to men. So there's a body of activism which emerges in order to address the physical disparities faced by men and women working under these new industrial conditions. And then on the other hand, you've got what no longer reads as feminism, because we're out there, we've gone through another looking glass since, but a whole other body of what to me reads as straightforwardly as feminism, which is the aggregate response by those women who opted out of the workplace because they could afford to, and who retreated into the now private home, which became a locus of respite from market society. And this is a huge body of writing and a huge body of creative work that now gets feminist historiographers sometimes call this dismissively the cult of domesticity. But really what it is, it's the response of women who've withdrawn from being economically active because it's either that or your baby gets mangled in the spinning jenny, but who still think what they're doing is important and they want to make the case for that, and they're doing so in the teeth of a new economic order in which they're radically disempowered relative to their agrarian sisters, their foremothers, I suppose I should say, because I mean all of a sudden they're reliant on their husbands for subsistence in a way which an equal economic participant in a productive household, it wasn't like that quite. And so women are saying, well, actually what we're doing is important. The moral education of children is important. A space of respite from the rigors of economic competition in the market society is important. I don't think they would have put it like that, but that's essentially the message of the cult of domesticity. And women's work matters. And to me, this reads straightforwardly as feminism, even if from the perspective of second wave critiques of the so-called cult of domesticity, it reads as propaganda for the patriarchy and for the oppression of women as second-class citizens within a radically disempowered private sphere. So this is kind of the backdrop. So and really this is one of the poles of the original women's movement, with the women's movement as response to the Industrial Revolution. But then against this feminism of care, the feminism of domesticity, and of defending the importance of women within this emerging industrial order, you also have those women who are saying, well, hang on a minute, this still doesn't work for everybody, because this only works if your husband likes you and is willing to do his bit. What happens if he doesn't? And because at this point, women have inherited a whole legal and cultural architecture from a time when where the political and economic balance of power was quite different, and in effect they're radically disempowered relative to the agrarian social order, and so they can't vote, they can't own property, they can't work, or it's frowned upon to work. It's socially it's low status socially to earn your own money. And under those circumstances, if you were married to a husband who was irresponsible or an alcoholic or violent or neglectful or abusive, I mean, you have a problem. What do you do? And so you
think this is why something like prohibition comes about? Absolutely.
The temperance movement is straightforwardly a feminist movement, 100%.
Designed to restrain the worst impulses of men who would cause that social.
Absolutely. If you read the writings of the temperance activists, women were heavily represented amongst temperance activists, and it was overwhelmingly a movement oriented towards protecting women's interests in circumstances where otherwise they could suffer a great deal and have very little redress and very little leverage in order to improve their situation. It's very, very difficult to get divorced. So under those circumstances, then you also start to see women saying, well, this isn't good enough. We need political agency on the same terms as men. We need to be able to vote. We need to be able to own property. We need to be able to work. And of course, and this is where the class asymmetry begins to creep in, of course, because working under these circumstances really means working if you're middle class and can do a desk job. Because work, if you do manual labor, there are the physical disparities between men and women are such that you can't as easily make the case for men and women for demanding equal treatment between men and women. And there are some really interesting historic conflicts within feminism particularly over whether or not workplace regulations should recognize sex difference or obliterate sex difference, that are straightforwardly class conflicts between women who do manual labor and women who do intellectual labor. So, but this really is the germ of the feminism of freedom, which you see in the writings of Harriet Taylor Mill, who was very, very, she was the first or second wife, the wife of John Stuart Mill, who I'm sure you're familiar with,
of course,
and who heavily influenced Mill's work on the issues faced by women. I mean, some now argue that she basically wrote it. In any case, I mean, who knows? But in any case, they worked very closely together, and her case was straightforwardly that women must be afforded in every way the same opportunities as men, and from a middle class perspective, that seemed like an obviously just and obviously appropriate case to make. And this is the beginning of what I see as the feminism of freedom. And both sides, as I've tried to explain here, have some justification. Both of them have a case to make, and both are united in accepting that men and women are to some extent different. And women's reproductive role is different to that of men, and between them there's a back and forth between the questions of freedom and the questions of care, and the aggregate effort is to try and within a recognition that men and women are physically different, to make the case for women's equal access to the goods of modernity, and trying to balance the interests of men and women. And my argument is that this reached a crunch point in the middle of the 20th century, and that we're now in a different era, really a post-industrial era that I think of as the cyborg era, in which the feminism of freedom is the only one that really has any sway at all.
And so what's interesting about this argument in particular, and I think it's largely true, is that it goes against the kind of typical conservative cope about how, all this stuff comes out of ideas. It's like some nerds in a grad school department decided that women must be in charge, and therefore you have feminism and all of its attendant consequences. Whereas it seems like these ideological forums existed to capture a set of interests that emerge out of the consequences of technology.
Yes. I mean, Phyllis Schlafly, who is by no means a lib and by no means a creature of ideas, made the point some time ago that women were emancipated not by feminism but by the washing machine. And bluntly, I think she wasn't wrong.